This is Talking Foreign Policy, a critical look at Canada's role abroad, and I'm Yves Engler. Today we have activist and lawyer Dimitri Lascaris to discuss the fast-moving developments in the Middle East. Over the past 10 days or so, Israel's killed around 2,000 in Lebanon, a whole series of different attacks, displaced about a quarter of the country. Alongside this, of course, they continue their Holocaust in Gaza, horrible massacres over the night. Last night, I think 120 people killed on Tuesday. And in response, in this context of responding to some of Israel's attacks in Iran, in Lebanon, elsewhere, last night, the Iranians fired 200 rockets into Israel, and it appears that a whole bunch of them hit their targets, military targets, I should say. Apparently no civilians, maybe one Palestinian, actually, in the West Bank, killed because of shrapnel, but no Israeli civilians killed, but it appears many different military targets that were hit. Now, Justin Trudeau, Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's response to Israel's or to Iran's rocket attack was, quote, Canada unequivocally condemns Iran's reckless attack against Israel. It puts innocent civilians at risk. We fully support Israel's right to defend itself against this attack, and we repeat our call for de-escalation across the region for the safety of all civilians. Dimitri, what's your response or take on Prime Minister Trudeau's unequivocal condemnation?
Well, I thought back immediately to the destruction of the Iranian embassy in Damascus several months ago, which precipitated the first attack by Iran, or retaliatory attack, I should say, by Iran on Israel. And how did the Prime Minister respond at that time? This was the destruction of the Iranian embassy in Damascus. This is considered under international law to be Iranian territory. This was a frontal assault on Iranian sovereignty, a plain violation of the diplomatic convention, of the United Nations Charter. Did he say that Iran had a right to defend itself? Of course not. It was radio silence, Eve. What he's doing now is basically, I'm sorry to be so crass about it, but like a yapping chihuahua, is just repeating the talking points that have been given to him by Washington. He's on a leash. The leash is held by Uncle Sam, and he will repeat whatever talking points, as will Western European leaders, by the way, that are delivered to him by the American government. And what I thought was particularly, I mean, if we weren't talking about an absolutely catastrophic war, which is going to result unquestionably in far more casualties than we've seen thus far, it would be comical. And I'm referring here to the follow-up commentary by the Canadian Foreign Minister, Melanie Joly, and I'm going to read some of them to you. So Joly is asked to expand upon how Canada feels about what happens next. And Joly said, listen, we are taking this one day at a time. At the moment, our concern is that there not be a generalized war in the Middle East, and that's a real concern. Israel has said that they would retaliate. So the question is, how can we be assured that this retaliation doesn't become, as a consequence, a generalized war in Israel? And when asked how far Israel might go before things tip into that generalized war, Joly said, that's the big question. Now, Yves, all of this reminded me of one of my favorite movies, Bull Durham, which you may recall was about a veteran catcher played by Kevin Costner and an up-and-rising superstar pitcher played by Tim Robbins. And at one point in the film, Kevin Costner advises Tim Robbins how to respond to questions by sports commentators. And he gives him a series of vacuous talking points, one of which was, I'm just taking it one day at a time. You know, she sounds like Tim Robbins in Bull Durham. This is absolutely meaningless gibberish, and at the end of the day will not contribute in any way, shape, or form to détente or de-escalation in West Asia. Canada is on autopilot. It is doing and saying what it is told to do by its masters in Washington, and I'm afraid to say that that is the perception in the large part of the world. Certainly outside of the West, Canada has become a complete and utter geopolitical pipsqueak.
Pipsqueak maybe, but I would say they're enabling the violence that Israel's unleashed. I mean, obviously, we've seen how they've enabled the violence in Gaza. We're not going to get into all of that, but the solidarity missions that Malaysia went to Israel in the early times, the Canadian Arms charity supporting it, Canadian military supporting the Israeli military, goes on and on and on. But also, I mean, they're like what Netanyahu takes from this. I mean, Netanyahu obviously understands, as you're pointing out, that this is Canada just echoing what Washington's saying, but it's one further force that is opening up the avenue for letting Israel do whatever Israel wants to do. And so, in the context of something that's very, very scary. Also, I just wanted to read out another quote. A few days earlier, same kind of dynamic with when Trudeau spoke with Lebanese Prime Minister. I spoke with Prime Minister Mikati about the situation in Lebanon. The people of Lebanon deserve to live in peace and security, free from conflict and from Hezbollah's Iran-backed terrorism. Right? So they're not free from Israel's Canadian US-backed terrorism. They're need to be free from Iran-backed Hezbollah terrorism. So again, basically justifying Israel's bombing in Lebanon, justifying what's a ground invasion. We've seen that today. There's been a reaction, or that there's been the Hezbollah has killed 8 Israeli forces. So I'm guessing Israel is going to be more tentative in pursuing the ground invasion further. That's of course where Hezbollah has a lot more kind of capacity than the air war. But yeah, so what's your take just on the sort of like reaction? I mean, it's all moving very quickly here, but the reaction to the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, and what your sense is also of what that all means. What is Israel trying to do in Lebanon, and how does that fit into the broader picture of Gaza, Iran, the region?
Well, you're quite right, first of all, to point out that they're enabling. They certainly are doing that, but it's a collective Western effort to enable Israel. And I think it goes beyond enabling, Yves. I think they are actually encouraging this kind of conduct. There was a report in Politico that just came out, which revealed something that I've been saying for months. It confirmed that although the Biden administration and Trudeau and other Western leaders, so-called leaders, are calling for de-escalation, behind the scenes, they're actually telling Israel, go ahead, do this. We've got your back. That's what Politico said. So they're not just enabling it, they are actually participating indirectly in the destruction of West Asia, and particularly at this moment in time, Lebanon. In terms of terrorism, first of all, we could go on for hours and hours about how everything Israel is doing in Gaza and the West Bank meets the classic definition of terrorism. But let's just focus for a moment on Lebanon. The BBC did a report which showed that 80% of the attacks in the cross-border conflict between Hezbollah and Israel in the last year were launched by Israel, 80%. The amount of infrastructure, I was there 4 times in South Lebanon in the last year. I can tell you that the amount of infrastructure that has been destroyed there before the last 2 weeks of depraved violence by Israel was enormous. Clearly, like 3-story residential units being destroyed, leveled to the ground. The number of civilian casualties, even before this most recent escalation in Lebanon, was far higher than it was in Israel. They have invaded Lebanon 3 times prior to now. This is the 4th time. Hezbollah exists and came into existence as a resistance force to Israeli aggression. So it should be clear to anybody applying the Western definition of terrorism in an impartial manner who the terrorist is here. The terrorist is the United States, Israel, and the other Western states that are enabling and encouraging this. And where this is going to end up, frankly, is in the destruction of Israel. That's exactly what's going to happen. The Iranian missile attack yesterday showed, I think, without any serious doubt, that Iran has the ability to penetrate at will, using its best weapons, Israeli air defenses. It did that. I saw one video which showed 20 impacts of Iranian missiles on targets in Israel. That means, by the way, that they can destroy anything. If they can hit their military bases, they can destroy anything, including the Dimona nuclear reactor. That's how dangerous this situation is. And Israel, as you mentioned, just launched this, what I call a fake ground invasion. What they've done is they've sent a few soldiers to the border to test things out after doing nothing in terms of a ground invasion for the past year, even though they were being attacked multiple times a day by Hezbollah. Their military bases were being attacked. And what happened immediately, they were met with a bloodbath. We know of 8 dead Israeli soldiers, including officers. There were certainly many wounded. That's what they're telling us. So the economy is a wreck. Moody's just downgraded the debt of Israel again. People are fleeing the country. So even if you only care about Israel, even if that's all you care about, you should be pushing your government, whatever government that might be, to pressure Israel, including by means of sanctions, to stop its aggression, because ultimately this is going to destroy Israel.
Yeah, I think that's the only thing that will restrain the Israeli military, is these hard calculations within the geostrategists about, how much destruction are we going to get by destroying a bunch of stuff in Iran. Unfortunately, that we're seeing, it's all about power equations. One of the things I find a bit interesting in seeing how this kind of plays out in domestic Canadian politics is that someone like the NDP foreign critic Heather McPherson, who, as we've seen over the past year, has gotten sort of steadily better, right? There's been so much pressure, there's been so much popular disgust mobilizing on Canada's enabling of Israel's crimes in Gaza, sort of gotten steadily better. But then when it goes outside, specifically with Iran, when it goes outside of just Israel killing in Gaza, and it's just getting into sort of bigger geopolitical kind of battles, and specifically again with Iran, Heather McPherson, she tweets out in response to Iran's strikes, which, I know the Iranian government, certainly after the April attack against its embassy, when they responded, it put forward a whole legal argument that why they had a right to respond under international law. And I haven't seen quite as elaborate on this recent response, but they've kind of hinted at it in some of the statements I've seen from Iranian officials. And you obviously know better than me whether Iran's response is legitimate under international law. I think from a moral standpoint, it's clearly legitimate. Whether it's legally, we can have that discussion a little bit. But Heather McPherson, she feels the need, this NDP foreign affairs critic, she feels the need to, says, the escalation in the Middle East is terrifying. The world is failing to prevent even greater horror. So I'm fine with that. And then she goes, we condemn these actions by Iran. And then civilians in Israel, Gaza, Lebanon, and the wider region will pay the price for a larger war. De-escalation now, diplomacy now, ceasefire now. There's no military solution to this crisis. So, I agree, I'm fine with kind of everything she says in there, but the need to condemn the actions of Iran. And when you look at that, there's all kinds of ways you could look at it. First of all, has Heather McPherson ever condemned Israel's bombing in Syria? So over the past 5 years, Israel bombed Syria at least 100 times. I would venture to guess she's never condemned Israel's bombing of Syria. And then you can look at all kinds of other things, but to sort of see how the NDP foreign affairs critic, who's gotten better on Palestine over the past year, still goes fully in the other direction when it comes to Iran's response. And let's be clear here, this is, if anything's going to stop Israel from its Holocaust in Gaza, it's going to be what Iran did. I mean, we've shown that, unfortunately, the popular protests are not. So I just kind of, what's your sort of sense of McPherson's response and some of that kind of the quote unquote left going along with this kind of this framing of Iran the devil and Israel is still sort of kind of legitimate.
Well, most people on the left in Canada, in my opinion, remain mortally afraid, not all, to recognize that it's not only white people and they're just who have defend themselves and used armed resistance. They're really afraid to have that conversation. And unless we are honest and treat non-white people equally and say that they have the same rights as those of us of European origin, this is just going to continue to escalate and ultimately will come back to haunt the West in a big way. The NDP, quite apart from it being mortally afraid of acknowledging that the peoples of West Asia, including the Iranians, but not just the Iranians, the Palestinians, the Lebanese, and so forth, the Iraqis, that they have a right to use armed resistance to defend themselves. What I come back to, Yves, and I've talked about this publicly numerous times, is that the NDP has been propping up the Trudeau government since the last election. And it has done so even though the Trudeau government was clearly complicit in genocide. And if there was ever a good reason to bring down a government, it's the fact that that government is enabling, as you put it quite rightly, a genocide and whitewashing the crimes of a state purported to be a close ally of Canada. But they wouldn't do that. And then they, with great fanfare, the NDP announced that they were ending the supply and confidence agreement. Since then, there have been numerous attempts, I think at least a couple, to bring down the government, and the NDP has not cooperated in bringing down the government. And then there was this fiasco over the arms embargo non-binding resolution in Parliament, which the NDP brought forward. The NDP allowed Liberals to gut that resolution, even though it was non-binding, Yves. The Liberals could have simply ignored it as a legal matter. But the NDP couldn't bring themselves to force the Trudeau government to vote against it, which would have revealed precisely what the Trudeau government's position is when it comes to the shipment of weapons to Israel. So at the end of the day, the NDP, yeah, it talks a good game, but when it has the actual ability to force the government to comply with international law, it folds up like a cheap suit. That's what it's been doing for the past year. The NDP does not have, and by the way, I extend my comments to Elizabeth May, who made this impassioned speech in Parliament recently where she castigated Netanyahu as though the only problem Israel has is Netanyahu. You know, the NDP and the Greens simply do not have the courage to stand up for human rights and international law. It's all just empty rhetoric.
Well, on that note, thanks a lot for coming on to Talking Foreign Policy. This is obviously lots of developments on this issue, and we'll probably have further discussions. Hopefully, we are not on the cusp of seeing a further expansion of the war in West Asia, and which still has the obviously potential to expand even more broadly. But thanks a lot for coming on Talking Foreign Policy.
My pleasure, Yves. Take care.